Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be addressing sexual orientations from a psychological perspective, but of course, and in order to have this conversation, we're going to be jumping all over the place from biology to psychology to sociology to history, even some philosophy. It's always going to get deep and complex because that's just how it is if we want to study human behavior. However, from a psychological perspective, of course, our main focus is going to be looking at, structures in the brain, our cognitions, our emotions, and things that are associated with sexual orientations. But again, all of that is influenced by the way our body works and also by the social context and all the interactions you're having and everything in the cultural environment to boot. Okay? So, to jump in to what is a ridiculously complex lecture, I'm going to try to keep it as swift as possible. And in many areas, I'm going to say, look, if you're interested in this, go find some research or email me. I have just so much research on all these topics. I have entire files that I can send you of awesome articles that delve deep into it. But for the purposes of this lecture, we're going to be looking at continuum theory, which is what your book highlights. I'm going to offer up a couple alternative theories to get us thinking beyond continuum theory because, is that outdated or is it relevant? Let's address it. I'm going to be talking a lot about this biopsychosocial approach to sexual orientations. We're going to be looking at social attitudes towards sexual orientations, positive and stigmatic. We're going to be looking at social movements about sexual orientations. And again, that I'll suggest, delve deep into history, some really good history there. And then we'll look at this psychology of coming out. And then we'll also look at LGBTQ, IA plus relationships in context. I'll just give you a quick little things about that. But that one, again, there's some deep research. So if you're interested in things like marriage and family, start looking at specific types of relationships, and then how are these relationships similar and different? There's so much research out there. So I'll point you guys toward that a little bit. Your book only has 1 or 2 pages on that anyhow. It's just kind of a concluding part. But the main focus of this will be looking at the biopsychosocial approach to sexual orientations. So continuum theory is, they generally recall Kinsey and the Kinsey studies as kind of the first one to approach this, is this idea that human sexuality can be categorized within this range between heterosexual and homosexual. And so I don't know if that holds up. I also put in on the bottom down here sexual configurations theory. Sexual configurations theory is a little more complex. Imagine that each continuum is like a galaxy. Like we're in the Milky Way, which is just one galaxy amongst, billions of galaxies in this universe that we live in. And then so you can kind of look at sexuality as a little bit more complex. So sexual configurations theory says it depends on all these different aspects of our identity and all these different aspects of our personality and the situations that we might find ourselves in. Like it just, what happens if you're in prison all of a sudden when this situation changes and you find yourself in this unique, different galaxy? I mean, is it that you're gay, or is it that you're just, sexual, or is it that's what you're interested in? I mean, it gets very, very complex. So, I mean, I'll introduce that a little bit. But again, continuum theory says that humans and our sexual behavior and our sexual desires and amorousness and biological processes range somewhere between heterosexual and homosexual. The first question we have to ask here is, again, with this biological approach is, well, is it in our DNA to engage in all kinds of sexuality? And when you look at evolutionary psychology and you start to apply this, you ask questions like, why do humans have the potential to engage in sexual relations with all kinds of things? All right. So, for example, sex reduces stress and it reduces conflict between people. So, does the ability to have sex with males and females and mixing it up, having all these diverse abilities to reduce stress and conflict, is that why it's in our DNA? For a long time, in like America and Great Britain, and depending upon the time you live in. And sometimes, like Alexander the Great's time, having sex with men, having sex with other men was totally normal. Alexander the Great was running around having sex with men and women and whatever. Then you come to like modern times, like 50 years ago, it was an absolute social taboo. And so again, you have to look at things like how does our culture structure our sexual behavior and our desires. But again, depending upon the time and the epoch, we are quite capable of engaging in a multitude of sexual behaviors. Okay. And so whether or not we range in our sexual behaviors between hetero and homosexual behaviors, again, is arguable. I like to add in things like context and situations and just all kinds of other variables that can kind of influence it. I find continuum theory just to be a little bit too simplified. Like there's just other things that have to be considered. Like you might be straight in some situations, but then what if you're like off with a bunch of the same sex people for years? I mean, really? You don't think at some point maybe again, it's just things to think about. And does that make you gay? And then here's some other ideas. Like down here on the bottom, we have this word queer. And queer is like an umbrella term for any form of sexuality that you want to be. And then pansexual is similar to that, and that you can, be attracted to multiple types of different sexes, whereas queer is a little more like whatever. But when you get into things like queer theory, do we actually need the categories? And so, again, once you identify with a category, how does that structure your behavior? Once you find out that you identify with a group or belong to a group of people that say they are or think they are black, for example, does that influence your personality and the way you behave? Yes. Once you find out you belong to a group of like females, does that influence the way you behave and think and your personality? Yes. Once you find out you're a Cincinnati Reds fan versus a Chicago Cubs fan, does that influence the team that you buy into? Yes. And so again, it's these categories themselves that can even further structure our behavior and mold our behavior and mold our desires and our wants and all these kinds of things, our motivations, what we seek. The idea here is it's incredibly complex. So, from a biological standpoint, you have your gonads, genitalia, hormones, all are playing a role. We talked a couple weeks ago in sexual arousal and response about pheromones and scent, and that, there are certain scents that arouse you, and that is just out of your control a lot of the times. I mean, yes, scent is also associated with culture, and then the scents that we're around becomes the scent we get used to, and things along those lines, but it's undeniable that someone's scent arouses us. And then there are gay men that the scent of other men arouses them and females don't, and vice versa. And it's just very complex. So when we're talking about sexual orientation versus sexuality, sexual orientation is all about categorical identification. But again, these categories are socially constructed and they deviate or they differ depending upon the time frame, the epoch, etc. There are times in human history where we didn't really have categories. Again, throughout most of human history, we have been pansexual or polyamorous. We're poly historically, not necessarily these monogamous nuclear family people. And that might be kind of radical to hear, but again, it's chapter 1 in my marriage and family textbook. Just go take that class and or watch my video that's on YouTube about it. And so again, you have to kind of remove yourself from this frame of where we're at in our time frame in human history and open your mind to, well, what all are humans really capable of. Again, humans will have sex with animals if not controlled. Humans will rape if not controlled. Humans will go after children if not controlled. The elderly. Okay, take a sexual philia class. It gets dark. So again, we need social control. And there's a reason that we have created these categories to mold and structure the expectations and norms attached to sexuality to control for some things so we can have some kind of a civilization where it's not dangerous. Not that that's really have any effect on the reduction of like rape against women, because I mean, again, it's like 1 out of 3. It's ridiculous. This is not cool. I mean, it's another side conversation we'll get at later. We don't need to go all dark and sad in this conversation. But again, when you would think about continuum theory, you can't just think about it from homosexual to heterosexual, because what about The philias, what about the attraction to children and all the things that we identify as sick or disgusting or abnormal, and then we label them. But again, society historically used to label homosexual under the same umbrella term as a dysfunction of the brain. And so I have put in there for your assignment this week to delve into how our social attitudes have changed over time, specifically how psychology as an institution has had to adopt and change and realize and apologize for some of the things that they have done in the past. Um, but again, so sexuality in general is a broad term of all that things that we are capable of. And so you have to realize that as humans, we are capable of a lot of broad things. And then sexual orientation itself is these categories, but it's us that create the categories in the first place. It's like racial categories. There are no biological differences between black and white people. That's an absolute myth. But since we created the categories, then we convince you that you're actually different. You might think you're different of someone who's Mexican if you're black, but that's not actually how genetics works. It's just you're false if you think you're different from someone based upon your skin color, for example. Again, if you study the Human Genome Project, the closest person to this dude in China was this dude growing up in Scotland. How is that possible? Because genetics are confounding. It's just a little bit, study it, look into that. But again, these categories structure the way we think and the way we behave. And so racial categories structure who we marry. Sexual orientation categories structure the sexual behaviors we engage in and what's appropriate and what's not. And then it also starts to, affect things like the scripts that you play. And then it's just ridiculously complex, okay? So when we're talking about sexuality, that's all the cognitions, behaviors, biopsychosocial of all sexual behavior. And then sexual orientation, again, is looking at the categories. Now, this is where it gets even more complex because you got to think about things like how does your biology influence the category that you choose to identify with? And then how does your gender identity, which is highly influenced by both your biological ideas about what category you think you belong to or you feel like you belong to, and then the social identification of what category you belong to. But when it comes to gender and biology influencing our choosing of what category that we are identify with, that plays a role. Because think about how you feel. Like, right? When you ask yourself, how do I feel? And what am I attracted to? And then you look out in the world and say, okay, what category best meets how I'm feeling? That is that process. But then again, our gender influences it because you're told as a kid through those heteronormative social attitudes that, oh, if you're a boy, you're supposed to get with a girl, right? And then it's not even until later where you start to have like a more open way of thinking, like, well, maybe I don't have to do that. You know, but again, that's because we live in a society that the door is not really open to sexuality and picking what you want later in life. You're socialized from a very young age as to what gender group you belong to, what sexual orientation group you're supposed to belong to. And then that influences us across the lifespan. And as we'll talk about in a second, things like stigma for those who deviate from these culturally constructed social norms. So the categories themselves that we're going to look at, of course, you have heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, mostly straight, mostly gay, mostly lesbian, pansexual, and it just goes on and on and on. But again, we're the ones who create these categories. We can label this and attach criteria to any words that we want to make up. When you're talking about the LGBTQIA plus identifications, this word in itself to me is confounding because it tries to blend sexual orientations and gender categories in one. And so I like to separate this out. I wish there were like two, one for gender identities and one for that. It's kind of like Hispanic, where we just try to combine all people in Latin America into one group, even if they don't really have common cultures. Okay, and then um, The same thing goes for race and ethnicity, and that I don't like to go race slash ethnicity. Like, race is a biological thing, ethnicity is a cultural thing. They are separate categories. Why are they commonly combined? Same thing with biological sex and gender. These are separate categories. I don't like sex slash gender. However, we have, as a society, included these groups as minorities to give voice and to reduce oppression. So again, complete respect. That's the same thing for why the word Hispanic was created, like in the 1960s. There was no such thing as Hispanic pre-1960s, but in order to reduce oppression and marginalization, victimization, and get a voice, we tried to group people together. There was a big social movement for that, okay? So when we're talking about some of these words like sexual fluidity, I think is, again, just remove all the categories, open up your brain, remove our epic and where we're at in history, and think what are humans capable of. And then continuum theory, again, is this idea between straight and gay. But again, is that sufficient? Are there more variables? Sometimes we might be straight, but then other times we might be gay, just depending on what's happening. You just never know. It gets complex. But again, do we all have the potential in us to engage in hetero and homosexual behaviors? Yes. But again, depending upon the chemistry of our bodies, the pheromones, the endocrine system, releasing hormones into our bloodstream to talk to our brain, our thoughts, our emotions, our feelings, the situation, the social context, the social molding, all of this stuff plays a role. So again, it's ridiculously complex. I'm not going to go super deep into everything because I'd be here for days. But again, my PhD is in this stuff. I've studied it for days. You guys are curious, just hit me up. All right. So again, what determines sexual orientation? Genetics play a role. Your mother's androgen levels in the womb can influence what you're attracted to in the end. So again, if you're a female who's attracted to women, is that associated with androgen levels in your mother's womb? It is. And so again, if you're going to blame anyone for your sexuality, can you blame your parents? And then that's kind of not actually accurate because your actual sexual orientation is not influenced by your parents. It's just general chemistry. It's just very complex. Because again, I'm starting to think about all this counterintuitive research because there's just so much back and forth. So androgen levels can be influenced by environmental factors and genetics, but it doesn't necessarily like influence like just your biology and your chromosomes that you're passing on to your kids don't necessarily like determine whether or not they're going to be straight or gay at all. It's very complex. It's kind of the idea. But again, pheromones, hormones, gonads, genitalia, chromosomes all play a role. Psychological factors like cognitions, emotions, motivations, perceptions play a role. The cultural environment, social norms, how we're structured by society, things like cultural social control also play a role. When you're looking at social attitudes and you're looking at positive or negative, again, you need to take a historical approach. I got to put that in there for an assignment for you guys this week, just to kind of look at our attitudes towards sexuality over the decades. Again, depending upon the time frame in American history, sometimes we're cool with it, sometimes we're not as cool with it. Sometimes we're cool with it if you keep it in the closet, and then other times we're like, no way, and it just depends. So again, throughout, up until about the 1950s and the 1960s, we would literally institutionalize you, label you as a deviant, label you with a psychological disorder if you identified as anything that deviated from culturally constructed norms about heteronormative behaviors of what you're allowed to do sexually. Okay? However, then in 1973, we had a change and a shift, and we, as a psychology profession, the American Psychological Association, decided that we are no longer going to be labeling sexual orientations such as homosexual as deviant. However, we still have our paraphilias against children and things along those lines that we still label as deviant, diagnose that as a psychological disorder, and possibly sociopathic. Okay? And then in the 1990s, 2000s, we've definitely had a much more positive shift in our attitude. However, stigma still exists. So if you're interested in stigma, I recommend looking at things like minority stress theory, looking at social stigma theory. looking at how experiencing prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, victimization psychologically affects you, how the cultural context influences your decision to come out, how repression and rejection from society affects you, how internalized homophobia affects you, okay? But when you're looking at stigma theory, I generally look at it as all stigma starts from structural stigma, okay? The macro, social, institutionalized attitudes, laws, and policies about what's cool regarding sexual behavior. This then trickles down into interpersonal stigma, which you can think about as like while your daily interactions, where you're going about your day, maybe experiencing microaggressions, victimization, slurs, that kind of stuff. And then you have your individual stigma, which is the internalization. Okay? And that's the realm of psychology, right? How does the internalization of homophobia affect you? Well, what if you're gay and society is saying it's wrong to be gay? How does that influence the way you feel about yourself, your sense of self worth, of acceptance, of competence, self esteem? All of these things start to come into play once we get into here. And then, how do the actual experiences of prejudice, discrimination affect you? Right? And then how do you become resilient and how do you combat all of those stigma and that prejudice, discrimination, etc., that you might experience in the social context, right? And so again, it gets very complex here. But again, stigma exists: prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, suppression into the lower classes, oppression. This causes increases risks of drug and substance abuse, HIV, AIDS, sexual disease, things along those lines, because of lack of access to health care. It increases homelessness. It increases poverty. It increases all of these things, okay? Just like racism. When you suppress an entire race into lower classes, you're going to see higher rates of all the things that I just mentioned. Why do you think Native Americans, for example, are most at risk for all the risk factors possible? What happens when you decimate an entire people and then stick them in the worst land and then economically suppress them? And then again, what are you going to see happen? Okay. So social movements, I put this in as a good discussion question for y'all. But again, you can look at, from thousands of years ago, every culture, continent, country on this planet at some point has engaged in homosexual behavior. From English kings to the Japanese to Muslims to, I mean, just everybody has engaged in this, to Alexander the Great. Okay? It's across time, across thousands of years. However, our attitudes about what is cool and what is not have changed. What do you think they were doing in the Roman baths? A bunch of men hanging out in baths together. I mean, seriously. You're not going to hear about that in your elementary textbook, but use your adult college mind and just, seriously. All right? So it's in our DNA. Again, evolutionary psychology. Reduce stress, reduce conflict. It increases serotonin. After you have sex, serotonin kicks in. It reduces your erection. It reduces that testosterone. It reduces just all of this stuff. It's just so good for you having sex. And it creates oxytocin, creates bonds. It creates all the endorphins just flying off and dopamine and all this good stuff when you have sex. Okay, there's a reason it's in us. But again, we've had social movements to reduce prejudice, discrimination, marginalization, and violence, such as the gay rights movements of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000, 2010s, 2020s. It continues. Just like how many waves of feminism have we had? We're up to like our fourth wave of feminism now. You had, suffrage movement trying to get access, trying to vote. Then you have the 1960s when you start to get into equal rights to areas, institutions. Modern times, looking at equity and pay, Me Too movement, reduction of violence. It never ends. Same thing goes for gay rights, racial rights. Again, stigma against minorities. This is all part of just larger minority rights movements. Okay, there's been tons of them. So any culture you want to look at. Right now, women in China are engaging in this huge feminist movement. It's kind of having to go underground, but they're trying to reject marriage and they want to have careers and they don't want to be stuck having babies. But China's running out of babies and just trying to force the women back into the home and back into having babies. And then. So again, that's going on right now. So again, it's always happening. Right now, Florida with the LGBTQI, that was happening for the last couple years. You're starting to see anti-diversity movements across several states, including in Ohio, where I'm recording this lecture now. Again, you're seeing a lot of backlash, but we've also seen a lot of movement. You had the Stonewall when the police raided and the riots broke out. People fought back. Beginning of a huge movement, decriminalization of sexual behavior, like in England. I have an article on there about with the history of that for you guys to read this week. Anti-discrimination laws, but we have anti-discrimination laws, policies. A lot of corporations adopt them, but only 22 states. You can still legally discriminate in most places, even though the U.S. Department of Labor is anti it and won't extend contracts to companies that engage in it. We're still having this continued equal rights movement and including equal pay. White male compared to a straight white male compared to a gay white male. Gay white male makes about 20 cents less on a dollar. Same thing with the straight white female makes 20 cents less on a dollar, whereas a black female makes, 30 cents less to a white man's dollar. So again, these intersectional layers of stigmatic or minority identities influence how much we get paid, things along those lines. Under Obama, we had the legal marriage for same sex couples. Whether or not that's in jeopardy with the Supreme Court now, we'll have to see. Um, Coming out, I don't want to speak too much on this because, again, this is just please look at some research. There's a lot of models to identify, look at the coming out process, and I'm a little bit critical of the models just because for everybody it's different, for every culture it's different, and I'm also with me it's like it, the idea of that somebody would have to come out, right? That's where I'm always a little confounded. I don't often bring my own personal opinions into stuff like that, but I mean, why is there a closet in the first place? Okay, this is like in the 1950s. If I was a black man trying to have sex with a white woman, I would have had to be in a closet too, but a different kind of closet because I would have had to hide my love for someone because of my skin color, or they would lynch me from a tree and then take pictures of it, and then all the white people would send pictures of me hanging from a tree dead with them smiling to their family as like, hey, we were at a lynching. I mean, the same thing goes for the LGBTQIA community. I mean, when it comes to views, hate crimes, violence, murder, death, I mean, this is all real. There's a reason that people have to hide their true identities. And so, again, it's a little upsetting that there's a closet for stuff. But let's be realistic because of social stigma and the suppression of identities and the fact that society will reject you if you don't identify with the categories it expects you. Again, if you don't conform to the social norms, again, that's where that all comes through from exclusion theory. You get excluded when you don't, conform to social norms. We have heteronormative attitudes in the United States, for example, that influence our behavior. And if you don't identify with that, do you get excluded from society? And historically, saying I am gay out loud would get you immediately rejected and excluded. And all the psychological effects from social exclusion are just incredible. And so, again, this is what kind of led to people in the LGBTQIA plus community seeking out other people because they're rejected from the mainstream society. And so they need a place where they're accepted to get that support. People need people in their lives. If they're cut off from other people, it breaks us. We need to be connected to society. We need to be connected to people. We need at least a cat at a bare minimum. And I don't know if a cat's enough in the end. Maybe it is. Who knows? But again, our ability to disclose truths about ourselves can be very hard. If you're a felon, just trying to say I'm a felon can be very hard. If you're trying to say I am gay, that can be very hard. And so people that say I am gay out loud, for example, they may experience stigma from their families, from their jobs, their workplaces, from religion, from schools, from the media, from economic institutions, from the government. It is just any institution possible. And so that's it. The fact that there is a closet means that people can't disclose the truth about themselves. And when you can't be yourself, that's the psychology of it all, right? What happens when you can't be yourself? It's devastating on the psyche, okay? So, again, I challenge you to go out and research the effects of minority stress and the inability to be yourself because you can't say who you are, all right? So, again, I've tried to keep this at 30 minutes so I don't go off for years and get everything out of my head because I go on for days. But again, it's complex. I'm just introducing you to a lot of these ideas with this lecture. So run with it and have a fantastic day.